What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Floyd Street's Finest, a Louisville podcast, part of the Field of 68 Media Network. I'm your host, and I'm your friend, Jeff Greer. I'm so excited to be back with you. I've got a great episode this week. A lot has happened between the last time we recorded a podcast and this time, just exclusively with Louisville basketball, let alone the rest of the country in college basketball, desperately trying to figure this thing out. I was one of many who was very disappointed that Baylor-Gonzaga did not go off as planned over the weekend, but I'm glad that everybody is trying to take precautions and be safe. And as a reminder, wash your hands and wear your mask. But today's episode, I'm telling you, great episode. There is no one better in the city of Louisville or anywhere in the country or the world to get a pulse of Louisville basketball and its fans than Mike Rutherford. He's my friend. We give each other crap all the time, but he is a good guy, knows the game really, really well. We talk about a lot of things. We talk about Louisville's NCAA case. I was going to say response. It was the NCAA response to Louisville's response to the notice of allegations. We talk about Louisville's 4-0 start. And we also get into our thoughts on the ACC and where it stands after seeing everybody a couple of times. And I made sure once again to pump Miami. That's been my dark horse team for all of the offseason, and they're off to a good start. They haven't really played super tough competition, but I still think the door is open for Miami to make a run in the ACC. We'll get to that. We'll talk a lot about Chris Mack and the status of this program as they're dealing with all this NCAA stuff. Before we get to my conversation with Mike, which runs a little longer than usual, but it's a good one, I just want to say, make sure, and I'm going to remind you of this, make sure that you subscribe and download this podcast and then go rate and review it. That's the biggest way for us to arrive into people's browsers when they're looking for podcasts. It's a great way for us to connect with Louisville fans for this one, or for fans of Kentucky, Indiana, whatever other program you root for. It's a great way for all of us to connect with a much larger college basketball fan base, and it allows us to pursue really cool things down the line that will make this whole product even better than it already is. So without further ado, and after you go rate and review this podcast, please enjoy this interview with my friend Mike Rutherford, better known to most people in Louisville as CardChronicle. Joined now by my friend Mike Rutherford, who is wearing is rocking the Hawaii hoodie. I love it. How you doing, buddy? Hanging in there?
That was the least enthusiastic intro I've ever heard to a podcast. But I'll say this, though. It's still better than the original intro from your first podcast, in which in the first 2 minutes, you both, one, took a shot at me, which was unnecessary, but I appreciated it. And two, I think 20 seconds in said, "I'm not a big word guy." It was an actual quote. You really stuck an audience into a podcast. So I'm just happy to be here after that auspicious start.
Well, if there's nothing that I learned from this life, it's that basically to sell something is to under-promise and over-deliver. So I try to under-promise. This will only build steam as we go for the next half an hour, I promise. But seriously, thanks so much for joining me. I know that you probably eventually got pretty annoyed last winter when I was texting 5 hours ahead or 6 hours ahead about whatever random college basketball stuff was happening. So it's nice to be back in the same time zone again. And you made sure to mention that you got a brand new computer, which is a nice little humble brag there too, Michael. But nevertheless, this is going to be a great pod. And I got to tell you, I am really intrigued to hear what your thoughts are to start off using that brand new computer to read these U of L NCAA documents. You have any initial thoughts on it? It just kind of seems like it's basically what we expected, and we'll see them in court and they'll see us in court, and that's how both sides seem to be talking to each other.
First of all, I got a new computer for the first time since 2013. So it's not like I'm just shelling out, however much money for a new laptop every 6 months. Like I told you this off air, Keith Wynn, our mutual friend who writes for CardChronicle, would make fun of me every time I posted a picture on social media that had the computer in it, because like my tab key's been missing since I think 2017. My space bar only works if you hit the very, very middle of it. And so, I mean, it was just pathetic for somebody who uses the computer literally every single day. The upgrade needed to happen, Jeff. So I'm not going to tolerate you
totally
slandering the new MacBook here. But yeah, I did use it to read. I made the joke this morning. As somebody who dropped out of law school back in, I guess, 2011, who would have thought that the decade ahead would include having to read all of this legal-ish stuff, you know, not technically legal documents, but kind of like what you read in law school. But rifling through this full disclosure, did not read the full 70 pages. I don't trust anybody who did, because I think that the entire thing can be summarized in that one line where the NCAA basically says, you've made no argument that leads us to believe that our punishments should be diminished or anything along those lines. And it was, I mean, I assume you're going to agree with this. It was basically the NCAA makes their allegations. Louisville says, we think the most significant of those are misguided. And the NCAA says, nah. And that's where we are right now, right?
Yeah. And so the funny thing about this is, so a few years ago, I was on, I forgot what it was live television, and they had me, I think it was actually ESPN. I'm pretty sure it was ESPN. I was very nervous, like extremely nervous, and making my stereotypical grumpy face that I always seem to make when I'm on television. And they asked me for my thoughts on the latest response from the NCAA or something. And I thought it was such a good comparison that got zero reaction whatsoever from anybody else on the show. But it really does feel like Revolutionary War times where they just line up against each other and fire muskets. Like nothing is changing. A couple people might fall here and there, but really, honestly, this thing's was always going to go to a panel. And the reason that you can make that prediction from the get-go based entirely on whether or not they decided to go through the document swap. Like the document swap typically is a sign that neither side is really going to budge a whole lot on any of this stuff, because if they wanted to get this done quickly and they didn't want to fight over stuff, they would have had that summary agreement or whatever it's called. I know the wording keeps changing, and they would have been done with all of this months ago when the allegations originally came out. But yeah, I mean, it just feels like Louisville is trying to thread the needle, and the NCAA is trying to thread the needle. The NCAA spent so much time acting like the schools were the victims, and these shoe companies and apparel companies, whatever you want to call them, were sort of the bad guys in this situation, the agents and the rogue shoe representatives who were using the institutions as victims. And then they turn around in the NCAA investigations, and this isn't just Louisville, obviously. This is NC State, this is Kansas, this is all these other schools, and they're saying, no. Actually, the shoe, that the shoe representative represents your interests, and you're in trouble for that. And like the biggest thing that they cite in the Louisville documents is John Carnes, the compliance director for Louisville, who is a person who a lot of people around U of L have a lot of respect for testifying in court, saying that that Adidas in this case represents Louisville's interests, and then confirming that 10 months later in an interview with enforcement people. But it's just such an awkward fight for them to have, and then for Louisville to try to turn around and say, okay, well, some of this stuff doesn't apply to us because these guys don't represent us, but our compliance guys said they would. So basically, it seems like we're setting this all up for this new panel that we have no idea what to make of, is going to basically have to determine precedent for however many cases it is now that are going in front of them.
I think the real strange thing about this, and you and I looking at this from the Louisville perspective, and all the other fan bases looking at it from their perspective, or beat reporters looking at it from Kansas or NC State's perspective, is the overall setup here is so absurd. You've got the federal government, the Southern District of New York. Billions is based on this guy, right? Like it's Paul Giamatti's character. Like this a very powerful entity in the overall landscape of America. They argue that Adidas defrauded all these schools. We have federal trials, federal government rules. Adidas defrauded these schools. People serve legitimate jail time for this. And that in and of itself is absurd. Like the whole thing was just
absolutely
ridiculous.
Insane.
None of those people may have been shady guys. If you watch the HBO documentary a few months ago, I think you can come to the conclusion that everybody involved in this knew that they weren't supposed to be doing it. I don't think anybody involved in it knew that jail time was even like a possibility. And yet we had several people actually go to jail for this. Now we flip it around, and you understand why schools like Louisville and Kansas and NC State are saying this. They're saying, look, we've gone to court over this, the highest court possible, almost the highest court possible, and they've said these people did not represent us. In fact, they defrauded us. And the NCAA is just like, no. And I'm not saying the NCAA is wrong, but you have to understand why Louisville would make this case and why it would seem like a logical argument. And just having to dive back into it, it reminds me so much of every single NCAA case where people, I think, the lines between NCAA bylaws and the actual law of the United States of America gets blurred. So, I mean, I'm sure you've seen it a bunch of times too, where people respond to you on Twitter and they say, well, they broke the law. Like, no, it's like, there's no law that you can't give money to another person because of one. There are NCAA rules, and that's what we're dealing with here. But again, just the whole, the absurdity of the entire thing is, I think, far too often gets lost on us because we're all bogged down in the details. But you mentioned the IARP. Everybody, since this whole thing started, has said this is going to wind up going the IARP route, which is impossible for me to say. I
just say YARP
every time. I'll ask you, because I've just kind of, like you said, I've assumed the entire time that this is the destiny for this case. Is there a possibility that this winds up being decided by the NCAA's Committee on Infractions and not the IARP?
Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that Paul Giamatti saying we have your playbook is like the most like obvious, like I can see it right now, like right in front of me. I can imagine him saying that in his very SDNY voice. I don't think so, though, as far as the IARP. I'm pretty sure, and there's been so many different changes to the rules and everything, but I'm pretty confident that and you know me, I always hedge with this stuff. So like 99% confident that if they go the IARP route, one, there's no appeal, and two, that's it. Like whatever the ruling is, everybody has to live with it. I would feel more confident, or at least a little bit more comfortable making an assessment of Louisville's chances in a case like this if it was just going to the infractions panel, because it feels like the infractions panel probably would hammer all of these programs, kind of just a baseline hammer of everybody. And I don't know what that would necessarily look like. And I do legitimately think that the people who would have made up the infractions panel for any of these cases, NC State, Kansas, and I realize these are all varying degrees, and no one's arguing that there wasn't wrongdoing based on the NCAA's policies. But I would think that they would be mindful of March Madness and understanding that Kansas and Louisville and Arizona, you've got to, like, those are big time names that I know that in the 80s, they were more willing to take big swings at programs that might have some clout. But I just don't think that they would – I think they would be mindful of that when they're trying to consider what they were going to do with these programs. But with this IARP, I have no idea. It could honestly, Mike, it could honestly be the same exact thing, just under a different name, and we just end up with the same result.
And everybody always brings up the point that you just made, which is the fact that there's no appeal process in this. Whatever the IARP decides, that's it. It's game over right there. That's not a deterrent whatsoever for Louisville, or at least it shouldn't be, because I think the funniest thing about the last round with the NCAA was that when Louisville filed its appeal, the NCAA's response to that appeal was, you made a lot of good points. You're right. By our own bylaws, we should have taken your mitigating factors into consideration, and they should have had some sort of impact on their punishment, and it didn't. And then after saying all that, the NCAA was like, but we're not changing anything. So, you know, what reason would Louisville have to go to want that appeal process to come if they've already gone through it once, argued effectively, had the other side admit that their argument was effective and right, and still have nothing changed as a result of that? Like, I don't think that that's going to play into Vince Tyre or whoever's mind whatsoever. It's just, it's so, to use the word again, it's weird to see not just Louisville, but all these other programs lining up to go this route without having any sort of idea as to who knows. For all we know, like, these former lawyers and judges could say, we're going to hit you with a 7-year postseason ban. Like we have no idea how this is all going to work. It could be worse than the Committee on Infractions, but everybody, that's how bad the NCAA is when it comes to their perception, is people are like, new thing, no idea how it works, whatever, sign us up. We're going to go that route.
And it has a little bit of that mom and dad feel to it, where it's like, my decision is final. You cannot appeal. Like, but dad said I could have the Coke. No, my decision is final. This is it. So there is that finality. I think also, and I forgot who tweeted this, so I feel badly that I'm about to just say this on my podcast without proper citation, but someone in Louisville Twitter mentioned that this puts Louisville, I want to say, third, fourth, or fifth in line if they follow a timeline of who goes first, second, third, and all of that stuff with future IARP hearings, which, I mean, for fans of Louisville who followed, I mean, who remember the 2016-17 season or the 2017-18 season, like, it doesn't care. The process does not care where you are in your calendar season or anything like that. I mean, they could have a hearing on the Monday of NCAA tournament week for all we know. You just never know. But it just seems like this is even murkier territory than anything to do with the first of the Katina Powell, Andre McGee case.
Yeah, I know NC State was the first to officially announce that they were going to do this, and they filed their case in May and has not been heard by the IARP yet. So that was 7 months ago. So if we're talking about timeline, and Memphis has gone this route, even though their deal with James Wiseman has no relation to the FBI stuff. Mm-hmm. Kansas has gone this route as well. And I believe there's one more. I could be wrong about it. I don't think it's Arizona, but I think Louisville would be fifth in line is what I'm getting at here. And you're right. I mean, this could be 2 years down the line. We're still dealing with this. We're still talking about punishments, which, hey, good news. You're eligible for the NCAA tournament this year and potentially next year. That's great for these young players that have been overachieving so far this year. Not so great for recruiting and not so great for the fans, which are, understandably tired of having to deal with all this. It's strange to think, if you want to lump the Katina Powell stuff into this and go back to the fall of 2015, it could be depending on what the punishments wind up being, it could be 10 years. It could be a full decade before Louisville is back to quote unquote normal and out from underneath and the dark cloud that keeps getting brought up by everybody, which is just, I don't think anybody ever would have imagined that if you'd gone back to, September of 2015 or October of 2015 when this whole thing got started.
Yeah, well, the one thing that Louisville, and I know that I'm sure you've said this 100 times, everybody says it, the one thing that I think really will hurt them, it almost doesn't matter in this one small corner of what the NCAA or what the IARP decides with school X, Y, and Z. When Louisville was on probation and Jordan Fairs was quoted in, I think it was a video, saying, we've got to be real careful about this. And right. I just feel like that it almost like it's kind of like the same with the Katina Powell case, where we, like you said earlier, the NCAA and U of L went back and forth and everybody kept trying to figure out what might happen in front of the panel. And then I think we all kind of thought this might end up being hashed out over benefit numbers and all this stuff. And then the chair of the panel that heard the case came out and said this was shocking and unprecedented. And it didn't matter. None of it mattered. And I just wonder how much we're twisting in the wind talking about all this stuff when Louisville's on probation, and that just makes them a different case than everybody else.
No, you're totally right. I mean, it is kind of funny how much time, and you wasted more than I did back in the day because you were bogged out.
A lot of wasted time.
Details I mean, looking at, and I'm sure all the people, the lawyers making Louisville's argument certainly were looking at, the dollar amount from the Fab Melo case with Syracuse, the dollar amount from some of the other cases that were going on. They laid all that stuff out and said, this is our dollar amount, compare the two. There's no comparison whatsoever. And the NCAA basically laughed and was like, you can't be serious. And when you saw that word for the first time, repugnant, was the exact word. I think that's when every Louisville fan was kind of like, oh, expletive. Like it doesn't matter how well we argue this, we're going to get some form of being hammered here. And you're right. I think that you can't get around having whatever took place, which I think that even every Louisville fan helped. I mean, U of L's admitted it at this point. There was some rule breaking that took place, and it took place under the umbrella of probation. And that's what separates Louisville's case from every other case involved here. Because if you looked at it, I mean, Kansas, they've got 5 level 1 violations. Arizona, I think, had 5 level 1 violations. Every case out there that's been alleged has been less significant by the NCAA's own terms than Louisville's. I think the one exception, and it's scary to admit this if you're a Louisville fan, is Oklahoma State, which already got 1 year postseason ban. So if that's kind of the floor that the NCAA is working with, I think that makes you nervous if you're a fan of any of the programs that still have to have their cases heard. And another thing that I think has been downplayed a little bit in recent months. Remember the Commission on College Basketball came out, and it's been made fun of by sports fans, college basketball fans. The Condoleezza Rice, who apparently has to be on every commission involved in sports for some reason. I don't know why. But they came out, and one of their big recommendations was harsher punishments across the board. And I think that they said, 5-year postseason bans and all this crazy stuff. And everybody kind of rolled their eyes. But if you actually look at the way that the NCAA has punished offending schools since that Commission on College Basketball came out, it's been harsh punishments. The only reason we haven't noticed it is they've been revoking records of programs that have had bad seasons. Like they took away 2 of DePaul's seasons. They took away 3 of Connecticut seasons that were awful. They took away the Dennis Smith Jr. season at NC State. Like, these are significant punishments. We've just kind of laughed at them and made jokes about, well, the fans would love to forget them because they've been bad years. But that doesn't mean that the NCAA hasn't been on the warpath since this whole thing went down. And again, the only firm punishment that we have from any of the FBI stuff is a 1-year postseason ban for Oklahoma State. And they seem to be, again, the lowest of the offenders in all of this. So I feel like if you're hoping for the best right now, if you're a fan of Louisville or NC State or Arizona or what have you, you can hope for the best, but maybe brace for the worst. I think that's the right way to approach it. That's what I've been doing the entire time. Whatever your own personal worst is, expect that. And if it's slightly less than that, then, hey, you'll be pleasantly surprised.
Well, another thing that you can telegraph too, you mentioned under the umbrella of probation, also under the umbrella of still having the same AD, coach, president, like the argument that they got fired. Okay, yeah, that was a swift response after the second wrongdoing. And I don't know, that one, I've always made sure to mention that as a potential mitigating factor for Louisville, but it could also be an aggravating factor on the other side of the argument of saying they kept these people around and they did it again. And like, that's a sign of an institution that has no control. So I don't know, we'll see. But something that we'll transition to, and then I promise we'll talk about basketball. We'll probably have people skipping ahead on this until we're talking about the MTE. But one last thing that I've actually thought a lot more about the last couple months than I think I realized that I would have thought about. So Chris Mack comes in. He takes over a program that was obviously in sort of a wait-and-see mode. It needed a jolt. David Padgett did the best that he could under the circumstances. And Matt comes in. People are obviously very excited about it. They probably felt like they were in the clear. No, they probably didn't think they were in the clear, actually, now that my timeline matches up. So he takes over knowing he adds that potential year to his contract if they get a postseason ban, blah, 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 blah. But through now 2.5 seasons or 2.25 seasons or 2 1/8, I guess, we've got one full season under the belt for Chris Mack, 20-14. They go to the NCAA tournament, probably a little bit above expectations to get there. The following year started great. Seemed like maybe they were limping a little bit to the finish line. I don't know if you have the same feeling about February for Louisville, and then no postseason. Now you've got this weird ass season that everyone is just trying to figure out now. Feels like we're driving through a blizzard this season. And then we don't know when this stuff is going to happen with the NCAA and the IARP. I mean, you could, like you mentioned earlier, talking about a potentially 10-year period for Louisville where there's so much uncertainty. You could be getting into like year 6 or 7 with Chris Mack before you have a really great feel for the types of teams that he's going to produce in a regular, consistent season. And even then, presumably the recruiting will have been impacted the previous couple of years leading into this year where they feel like they're finally free and clear of everything and can actually just be a basketball program again.
Yeah, I've thought about this before. It's going to be a tough ask if this does wind up being the case where Louisville's dealing with this still in 2023 or 2024 in some form. It's a tough ask to tell your fan base you can't really properly judge this head coach who's been here for 6 years or for 7 years. But let's say that this season winds up going okay, like you said, who knows? It feels like we're driving through a blizzard. We may not even finish the season. You just don't know. Or it may be so bizarre that it's impossible to properly gauge. And then let's say that Louisville gets wrecked by the NCAA in one way or another, so much so that it's impossible to properly gauge the next 2 or 3 years. If they don't go well, if they're just kind of average or they're below average, it's going to be – I don't think that the – majority of the fan base is going to be able to take a rational stance on that or take a realistic stance on that. It's going to be Chris Mack bashing. And it's why I think having the NCAA tournament canceled last year, having the postseason canceled last year is such a wrench thrown into this whole thing, because that felt like it felt okay to judge Chris Mack based on last season. Because you're right, he overachieved in year one, but that team also kind of fizzled out down the stretch. And then you had a really, really disappointing showing in the NCAA tournament, a game against a Minnesota team that I don't think was all that good and that you probably should have beaten, and that somehow hit what felt like 1 billion three-pointers against you in that first round.
They ran him off the floor.
I mean, it was a bad game. And then last year you go in with really high expectations. You ultimately get to number 1 early in the season. And then I think if you're just judging it based on what we saw, which was a full regular season and no postseason, you have to categorize last season as at least a mild disappointment. Now, the thing about college basketball is you can make up for a bad 3 months with one beautiful 4-week run in the postseason, or you can ruin the goodwill of the past 3.5 months with a couple of losses in the postseason. And we'll never know how that would have played out. If you're talking about Chris Mack as a guy who took Louisville to the Final Four in year 2, then I think he's viewed very, very differently regardless of what happens in 2024. If you're talking about Chris Mack, the guy who came in and still hasn't won an NCAA tournament game despite coaching 2 full teams that were pretty good, then I think that also is a totally different view 4 years from now, if the next few years are still rife with controversy and lack of scholarships and postseason bans and all that stuff. So it's such a strange situation. And then how do you handle that if you're the athletic director? If you're Vince Tyra and the team is, let's say they have a losing record 2 years from now because we can't get anybody to come play here and guys are transferring because there's going to be no postseason, how much of that do you take into consideration? It's all – I mean – it's been a mess. It's still a mess. It's probably going to be a mess in some form for the foreseeable future.
I think it's a really, really, really low percentage that this actually happens, but I'm envisioning Vince Tyra like the intern in Seinfeld who Elaine dates, and once he finally passes the boards to become a doctor, he immediately dumps her because once he became a doctor, he always planned on dumping his girlfriend and starting with someone new. Now, Chris Mack was supposed to be starting with someone new. So, yeah, I mean, look, I like Chris. I mean, I think he's a good guy. He's obviously a good coach. So, I feel like he has embraced – I feel like he has touched a nerve in a positive way with a section of the Louisville fan base that didn't feel connected to Pitino. And I think that's a personality thing. I think that's an upbringing thing. It's just a very different, the suave New York, intense Italian guy versus kind of a, I don't say working class, but just like a lunch pail kind of basketball coach. And I think he's really resonated with people here. And so it's fascinating to me how people respond to when Louisville actually plays games and has actually has results to judge themselves on, because I really think that Chris, people really like him and want to like him and want to root for his teams in Louisville. And it's just going to be forever until you can truly look at them and have that accurate assessment of actually, is this guy actually having success at this program? I mean, it's insane to me.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also important to remember, I think 80% of likability from a fan's perspective is based off of wins and losses. I mean, when Rick Pitino was hired at Kentucky, go back, if you've ever watched remember when they used to do those sports centuries on ESPN, and they did one on Rick Pitino. I think he'd only been at Louisville for a couple of years when it came out, and they interviewed all these Kentucky people. And when he was hired, it was a hated hire. Like, they thought that he might be able to win, but he was not a Kentucky guy. He was New York. He was slick, the suits, the hair, all that stuff. And when he started winning, none of that mattered. It was cool. And a lot of the same stuff happened at Louisville. When he was hired here, it wasn't just the lack of a cultural fit. It was, he'd been at Kentucky and he was more of a UK guy. He was Lexington. His wife loved it. All that stuff came up. And then when he started winning, didn't matter. And I think you saw it a little bit to kind of stay topical here. Look at some of the reaction from fans with Scott Satterfield over the weekend when the story came out about him interviewing at South Carolina, or having a discussion. I'm using air quotes here with South Carolina. All the same folksy stuff, the all shucks that Louisville fans were loving because it was such a contrast to Bobby Petrino. It kind of got thrown back in his face, like, you don't fit here, like, go on and get out. And Bobby Petrino was a guy who, when he came in here and was yelling and screaming, it was like, say what you will about his character, but he gets the job done. He's winning games. He's fighting other coaches for Kentucky. It's great. Everybody will kind of bend their own personal view of like what they like in human beings based on how the team's performing. And if Chris Mack gets it done on the court, yeah, it's going to be he's eating chicken wings at Roosters. He's joking with the fans on Twitter. He's just he's one of us. You could see him drinking beer at a bar and go up to him and have a conversation with him, and that's great. And if the results don't go the way, regardless of what he's working, what he's up against for the years to come, it's going to be, I want a coach who's not drinking beer in bars, not at Roosters. I want him in the film room 1,000, like, he has the swag and all. It's just, that's the way it works, man. And unfortunately, this is going to be no different.
Well, that's a perfect transition, and hopefully the people who are now tuning in after the beginning of this discussion can now listen to basketball if that's what they were looking for. He and his team are off to a great start this year, 4-0. They looked really, really good against Western Kentucky, a team that just has that feel. I mean, obviously in the Louisville game they didn't have the look, but they have that feel like they are going to be in a 5-12, 4-13 game against someone from Power 5 or Power 6 in college basketball. And that team is just going to fill their diaper, like having to deal with these guys. And Louisville clean their clocks, especially towards the second part of the second half, last 5 minutes of the first half. And then the second half just ran away with it. There's a solid win against Seton Hall, although it looked a lot like year one where they blew a big lead in the second half and had to hang on to a missed free throw. And then two teams that they should have beaten, they beat comfortably in Evansville and Prairie View A&M. What's your assessment, I guess, after the first four wins? We don't know. I would say right now, I'll probably regret this. We're recording this on Monday, late morning, early afternoon. They're probably not going to end up playing Wisconsin this week. I could be wrong on that. But what's your assessment of this team through the first couple of relatively difficult games?
Well, first of all, nice save on the Power 6 correction, because they wouldn't have let you back in the Northeast if you'd stuck with Power 5.
Power 7, let's include the A10.
Get them in there. Go Rhodey. If you're a Louisville fan, I don't think you can be anything other than – I don't think ecstatic is too strong. I think you have to be ecstatic about the way that this team has played over the first 2 weeks of the season, when you take into account, being down three guys, one definite starter, Malik Williams, I think Charles Minlend would have been right there in that race to be the fifth starter heading into the season had he not gotten hurt. What was supposed to be a key reserve in Josh Nickelberry, and then losing a guy that everybody's been, he's been on breakout sophomore lists all off season. He was playing the best that we've seen him play, I think, so far in that first half against Seton Hall and Sam Williamson. And then he goes down and you lose him for, we're still finding out when he's going to be able to get back in the flow. And so to deal with all that, and also you're still down one scholarship guy from the first round with the NCAA right now. You only have 12 scholarship players to start. 8 of them have been healthy for the last week. You're bringing a new guy into the fold in Carlik Jones. You never know how grad transfers are going to gel. He's the only senior that you've got. Everybody else that you're playing is a freshman or a sophomore. To be 4-0 right now with, I think we can say, an ugly win over Seton Hall, who still, I think, is going to wind up being a solid team in the Big East. They had a great comeback and beat Penn State last night. They've got a terrific player in Sandro Mamu Kalishvili. Got that in there on the podcast.
Yeah, nice flex. Love it.
Throw that in there. But it's a talented team. If they get Bryce Aiken back healthy, I still think Seton Hall can be an NCAA tournament team. To have that win and then to just wax a Western Kentucky team that is not just talented, but coming off a really, really strong showing in that Bad Boy Mowers crossover classic. Another thing I've got to get in there. Played West Virginia really well, beat Memphis and beat Northern Iowa. To beat them that handily without Williamson, again, I think it's impossible for any Louisville fan to be anything outside of ecstatic. And also not just ecstatic about this season and what it may wind up being, but the next couple of years down the line. NCAA stuff aside, you've got a freshman who is exceeding everybody's expectations in Dre Davis, who's been, just kind of a revelation through these first 4 games. JJ Traynor certainly looks like a kid who can be a fantastic college player down the line. Mm-hmm. I think Jalen Withers has proven that all that offseason hype, which you never know when a guy's redshirting, you never know how much to believe when people are saying he's actually really good, just wait and see. And then to see it firsthand the last couple of weeks has been awesome. And then some of the other younger guys that we didn't see much of last year, Aiden Nagahan, Quinn Slazinski getting out there, playing, some solid minutes. I think all of that stuff is really, really promising for the next couple of years. So, yeah, to judge the first couple of weeks, it's been, I can't speak for anybody else. It's been much, much better than I thought it was going to be 3 weeks ago.
I would have guessed if they had played, if you'd said these 5 games will happen and you're throwing UNC Greensboro or UNCG in there, I would have probably thought 4-1. That probably I would have thought, you know what, they're at home, but you just got to figure with a young roster. You're asking a kid in David Johnson who played a lot last year, but you're basically handing him the keys with Carlik Jones, a guy he hadn't met, and really it's been a weird offseason. Now Louisville, of course, has had a little bit more time to gel as a group than smaller programs. I can't remember which team it was. I think it may have been Prairie View A&M. They had not been together as a group all together from the end of the abrupt end of March, the end of the postseason, until mid-September. So they literally were meeting each other a month, 6 weeks before the season started for any of their new guys, and they had a bunch of transfers come in. So Louisville has benefited from that, but I still thought that there would be some significant growing pains. It felt like they could probably get to 11-9, 12-8, maybe in the league, just because I think there's quite a few programs that are still in transition, either with new coaches or just lost a bunch of guys. But combine all of those things, and you're running into a team that's 18-9 or 17-10 or something like that, which in a season like this is probably pretty solid. But then to have Dre Davis emerge, like you said, JJ Traynor's length is a little bit – I guess I just didn't realize how long his arms were. The dude, it has bothersome athleticism. His ability to finish around the basket through contact is really impressive for a freshman who still looks kind of skinny. So you just have to figure – I'm not exactly certain or confident that Malik Williams will be back this year. It's kind of a throwaway season, so maybe not a throwaway season, but he's got kind of a dice roll to have basically. So maybe he does come back. And if that's the case, and all the other guys who have been day-to-day for the last 3 months all come back, then suddenly you're looking at a team that might actually be pretty good. Some of my buddies who cover ACC teams couldn't believe that I had picked Louisville to finish, I think, 6th in the league. They thought that was way too high. And so I feel like these early games have really raised the expectation for some people for what Louisville can be.
Yeah, I thought when the injuries started piling up a couple of weeks ago, I thought best case scenario for Louisville was you go 4-3 in your non-conference games. I'm with you. I thought that they would go 4-1 in these first 5, and they may still have. We'll never know what would have happened in that UNC Greensboro game. Although you, being the TV star who's now has seen UNC firsthand, they were a little bit disappointing in their first 3 games.
Mm-hmm.
So that didn't look quite as scary as it did going into the year. But I thought best case scenario for Louisville was you go 4-3 in those games. The younger guys get experience. Maybe some of them overachieve a little bit. You start working the injured guys back into the fold as the year goes along, and then maybe you're like, ironically enough, that Michigan team a couple of years ago that actually knocked Louisville out in Rick Pitino's last season,
mm-hmm.
that just got healthy at the right time, made a run, won the Big Ten tournament, got hot, and played deep into the NCAA tournament as like a 6, 7, 8 seed, something along those lines, maybe 5 seed if things go well. And now I think fan expectations certainly are changing just because, Carlick Jones, if anything, is even better than we thought he was going to be. David Johnson, I feel like we saw a glimpse of his best in that first half against Western Kentucky, but he still hasn't played up to his ability.
Mm-hmm.
Sam Williamson looked good before he got hurt. We don't know what we're going to need to get with Charles Minlin. And like you said, it's kind of if Malik Williams feels healthy enough in mid-February or late February to give it a go, he gets this year back. Like, everybody can play next season with eligibility. So unless he's worried about re-injuring himself to the point where he's not able to go by, October of 2021, then there's really no reason for him not to at least try, which would obviously be a gigantic boost for Louisville. But now I think when you're seeing how well Jalen Withers is able to hold down the 5, when you're seeing, Aiden Nagahan's looked better, you don't need – you can still be a pretty good team without a fully 100% Malik Williams being that, imposing defensive big man that he's been for the last couple of years, and hopefully an improved offensive game as well. It's just – and – we'll obviously know more as the season goes along and Louisville plays better competition. But for now, it feels like there's a really solid base, more solid of a base than I thought there was going to be for this team to have an overachieving 2020, 2021 season. I'm off on years. I've forgotten that this year actually.
That's okay. And we all are, yeah. What do you think? So typically, and I know we've talked about this a lot over the years with both Louisville but other teams that we follow too, and as a side note, for people who are big bettors and want to make sure their March Madness picks go okay, I really like UNC Greensboro, but it's got to be against another up-tempo team. So if they're in that 5-12, 4-13 range and they're playing like Creighton or someone like that who's going to absolutely try to just get up and down the floor and score a ton of points, I feel like they're better suited for that than a team that is going to be able to have guards who can break their pressure and then play like a 60 to 65 possession game because they cannot make shots. Maybe that'll change. But anyway, so we talked about your gut instinct as far as like concern. And I'm curious for what is there a nagging concern as a Louisville fan that you're still feeling about this team, or have they played so well that it's kind of erased any of those potential concerns that you had?
No, I think there's still a nagging concern. When you look at the makeup of the team right now, you've got 3 scholarship guys on the bench. They're all true centers. Like that's a very strange thing when you're looking at, we're starting Louisville starting a 6'8" guy at center who's not a natural fit there. I think Jalen Withers is still – his future lies at the 4, even in college. I think playing alongside a guy like Malik Williams would really benefit him. And then you've got nothing but true centers coming off the bench right now. It's a little bit – it's scary because when you're a fan in the middle of a game and a team's going through an offensive drought, I think your first instinct is to say, get this guy into the game. There's a shooter on the bench. Get Ryan McMahon in there. Get somebody in. Get Anton Gill in there. You're grasping at anybody who could come in and potentially make a difference offensively, and there's just not that guy for Louisville right now. And maybe that changes when Nickelberry and Minland and the other guys get healthy. But for right now, it's certainly scary. Lack of backcourt depth. What happens if Carlik Jones is, I'm not going to say hurt, but if he and David Johnson are having a bad night on the same night? So far, when Jones has gone, I mean, Carlik Jones has been pretty consistent so far, but the one stretch where he wasn't playing all that well, I think, was that first half against Western Kentucky, and David Johnson in turn was fantastic. But there have been stretches where Johnson's been pretty bad, and Jones has been there to pick up the slack. That's probably not always going to be the case. I mean, those are your two alphas right now. Those are your two stars. They're probably going to be taken out of their game at least once or twice this year against an ACC team with a really talented backcourt and a really athletic backcourt. Where do you turn then? I think that would be the question right now. So while Dre Davis has overachieved, while Jalen Withers has been really good, while J.J. Traynor has been much better than we thought he was going to be, it's still a small sample size. It's still 4 games against 4 teams that are I think a couple of them are good, but they haven't played a really great team right now. They haven't played a legitimate top 25 team yet. So we'll find out more when the ACC games start coming. And I would throw Kentucky into that mix, but man, not a legitimate top 25 team right now. Jeff, have you seen this? Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I'm shocked that it took you this long to twist the knife to your rivals there. Well, one other thing that I wanted to say about the rotation, the thing that has been something that I guess I should have accounted for and I just hadn't thought about. It's still super early, obviously. And David Johnson has played so well. He's a good kid. I like him. Really smart, really cerebral. So you assume that he'll adjust at some point. But he seems to be bothered by smaller, quicker guards who have figured out that they can kind of get into him and draw fouls against him. He's got that length and the smarts, and he's a really good defender. But I think that when they play I don't know, a Jalen Cone at Virginia Tech or Kihei Clark, if I don't think Johnson would have to guard him necessarily every possession, but as an example, a smaller, quicker guard who is smart enough to know that they can get into him and draw fouls. Is that going to limit his playing time and contributions in a bunch of big games? That's something that has emerged to me as a little bit of an early season flag that might need to be waved with Louisville. Carlik Jones obviously has been fantastic. I am intrigued to see him play against another, really, really, really good backcourt. And that's Tavion Hollingsworth is really good, but we're talking about Virginia or Duke or places like that, North Carolina. The other thing is, I would agree with the depth. I don't think they really have any other ball handlers outside of those two. If you think about it, I mean, Josh Nickelberry, the reason that Josh Nickelberry went from being like a top 60 recruit in the country to plummeting by the time that he arrived was because Ashton Hagans left or enrolled early to go to college, leaving the AAU circuit. And Josh Nickelberry slid over to play point guard for his AAU team and had some good games, but also really struggled when people happened to be evaluating him. And that's not his natural position. So, yeah, he might be able to help you there. Charles Minland might be able to help you there, but he's kind of like a Dre Davis type player. Sam Williamson can help you there, but you don't want any of those guys as your primary ball handler. So we'll see. And I do worry about Louisville's depth beyond Jalen Withers among big guys as well in the interior. Last thing then, and then I'll let you get back to being a dad and dog dad and all those other things that keep you busy these days. When you think about the ACC as a whole, and I wanted to make sure we talked about this because I know you and I both were the dorks who look at our ESPN score app and are looking at, Arkansas Little Rock versus Canada Tech and being like, oh, wow, Marquise Noel has 25 points tonight. Anyway.
You sound just like
yeah, I know. It's kind of it was a combination of both of our voices, so don't worry. So what is your assessment? Have you been surprised by anyone? Have you been in a good way or surprised in a bad way? by people? Has it been what you expected? What's your kind of initial takeaway from these weird scrambled starts to the ACC?
Well, I think that's another good thing if you're a Louisville fan hoping for this team to be an overachiever this season. And it does kind of remind me of 2015-16 in that you're heavily relying on grad transfers. And I think most Louisville fans would agree that at least up to this point, Carlik Jones has been the best grad transfer this program has seen since Damian Lee at the very least. And he may wind up being better, who knows. But that team, we had just so little grasp on how they were going to be. But the good thing we knew was the ACC was a little bit down that year. I think the ACC is a little bit down this year as well, especially at the top. There's no team right now, and Carolina looked okay in Maui, but there's no team that I think strikes fear in you. Florida State has a bunch of athletes, but they're young. They lost so much from last year's team. Duke, you asked about, who is maybe disappointed me a little bit. I actually thought Duke was a little bit underrated coming into the season. They looked awful against Michigan State and then didn't look all that good. I watched a solid amount of their game against Bellarmine, Bellarmine's first D1 game against Friday. They really didn't – they didn't assert their dominance like you would expect a team in that mismatch to do. I think Jalen Johnson's going to get a lot better as the season goes along, but right now their young guys are just kind of young, and their best player so far has been Matthew Hurt, which – take that for what it's worth. He's a fine young man, but I don't think he's a superstar caliber player. And then Carolina, the guards didn't look all that good. I mean, Garrison Brooks is fantastic, but I still don't know if their backcourt is going to be improved enough to make this leap from terrible a year ago to legitimate national title threat this season. And then Virginia, the team that everybody felt the most confident about, has been super shaky. And they come out and set the world on fire on opening night, turn right around and lose to San Francisco, almost lose to Kent State the other night. And Virginia always gets better as the season goes along. I know everybody does, but Virginia especially kind of looks one way in November and early December, and then a totally different way in January, February, March. We saw that firsthand last year, but I just don't think the ACC is going to be the best conference in college basketball this year. I know the Big Ten is being super hyped, deservedly so. I'm not saying Louisville's going to definitely finish in that top 4 or even that top 5, but I think that you could see a situation where a Louisville team that's stumbling a little bit can still get right by beating a Carolina or beating a Duke or beating a Virginia who's highly ranked and in the top 3 of the conference. And I think it's another reason to feel good about the possibility of this team doing more than most people were saying going into the year.
And the door is wide open for my I realize I'm not the only one who thought this, but the door is wide open for my sneaky dark horse Miami to be a top 5 team. I absolutely love Miami. I was a little concerned that Earl Timberlake got hurt, but it sounds like he's only going to be out for maybe the rest of the month. When you get that dude back in, first of all, I thought that dude might be like freshman of the year potential in the ACC. But when you get that full complement back, the door is open for Miami to make a big-time run in the ACC. That's just my humble opinion. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for joining us. I'm sure you're very excited for the Wednesday night Division I home opener for your alma mater, Bellarmine, hosting Chattanooga. That's actually a nice little matchup. The Bellarmine looked fantastic last night at Howard. I mean, just ran them off the floor. Super efficient offense. Looked really good. Are you going to Freedom Hall on Wednesday, or are you going to be watching from home?
I'll be watching from home. Won't be able to make it out there, but very pumped for Scotty D and for Doug Davenport and Bo Braden and all those guys. I mean, they've been – I don't know how public it's been, but they haven't been able to practice a whole bunch. They've been one of those programs that has been dealing with COVID issues basically since they were able to start practicing, and they've been having to pause a whole bunch. So I think they were a little bit worried about how this first weekend was going to go. They, I think, held their own against Duke. They cut it to a one-possession game late in the first half and covered the spread pretty easily, and then they turn around and blast a Hampton team that they were underdogs against. It's a solid start for them. Excited to have another D1 basketball program here in the city of Louisville that's going to be fun to follow. It'll be a nice little sort of secondary team, I think, for a lot of Louisville fans to support during that first week of championship week where the smaller tournaments are being played.
Yeah, honestly, I've noticed a lot of Kentucky fans, too, favoring or liking tweets and stuff when you mention Bellarmine. I mean, it seems like everybody kind of is excited to just have another program. And like you said earlier, winning helps build your profile. And then, of course, people attach how much they like coaches to those programs. But Scotty actually has both of those things going for him. So he's a good coach, and I'll be doing play-by-play for that. So I'm sure that will ruin the experience for you.
I was going to say, they've also got the voice of the Knights, Jeff Greer. How could you not be on board?
It's very exciting. Well, thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate it. I will not bash you in the intro that I'm about to record. And thanks so much for sharing your insights. I'd love to have you on again sometime down the line.
Anytime, man. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, buddy.